On December 23, 2015, just 2 days before Christmas, a quiet suburban home in Ellington, Connecticut, became the center of a story no one in that neighborhood could have imagined. The street was calm. Houses were decorated for the holidays. But inside one of those homes, a family's life was about to fall apart. That afternoon, emergency services got a call. There had been a shooting. When police arrived, what they found didn't make sense. A woman was dead in the basement. Her husband was injured, shaken, insisting they had been attacked by a stranger. At first, it seemed simple enough. A woman killed, a man wounded, and the person responsible gone. It looked like a random home invasion, sudden, senseless violence that left devastation in its wake. But as investigators dug deeper, little things didn't add up. The timeline felt off. Movements inside the house didn't make sense. And with every retelling, the story shifted just a little. What seemed like chaos slowly started to look very different. This wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was planned, carefully, quietly, designed to look like something it wasn't. And the truth wouldn't come all at once. It came in pieces: phone records, vehicle data, step counts, and one audio recording from inside the home that would become central to the entire case. But before the investigation, before the courtroom drama, before the headlines, there was just a family living a normal life. Connie Dabate was 39, a mother of 2 young boys, a registered nurse, someone her friends and coworkers described as warm, organized, and dependable. She showed up for people, kept life running smoothly, even when things got stressful. She lived in Ellington with her husband, Richard Dabate. On the surface, their life looked stable. A comfortable home, kids in school, daily routines, plans for the future. Richard worked in insurance. Methodical, intelligent, someone who liked structure and control. Together, they had built a life that seemed functional, if not perfect. But behind the facade, tension had been growing. In the months before that December day, their marriage was unraveling. Trust was slipping away. Arguments became more frequent. Simple conversations now carried weight, uncertainty. What Connie didn't know, and what would later be key to the case, was that Richard was having an affair with a coworker. When the affair eventually came to light, it shook whatever stability was left in the marriage. Connie had to face a reality she hadn't chosen. And according to those who knew her, she didn't do it quietly. She demanded honesty. She questioned the future of their marriage. She started thinking seriously about next steps for herself and for her kids. Divorce was no longer some distant possibility. It was real. And with that possibility came consequences. Financial, emotional, personal consequences that would soon matter far more than anyone imagined. As December approached, the tension inside the Dabate household was obvious. The holidays were near, but the mood inside the home was anything but festive. Decisions were being weighed behind closed doors. And once those decisions were made, there would be no going back. The affair hadn't started with a single moment or sudden choice. It had developed quietly over time, in a place that felt normal, at work. Richard Dabate met Michelle Troconis through his job. At first, everything seemed professional. Conversations were routine, boundaries clear. But slowly, things shifted. Texts became more frequent. The tone changed. Familiarity turned into emotional dependence. By the time the relationship became physical, it wasn't just a mistake anymore. It had become a secret parallel life, existing alongside Richard's marriage, hidden from Connie, carefully managed. Michelle thought it was serious. According to later testimony, Richard spoke openly about being unhappy in his marriage. He described a strained home life, suggested separation was inevitable, and even talked about a future that didn't include Connie. But at home, that future hadn't arrived yet. When Connie found out, the impact was immediate. Trust was gone. The household balance shifted. Confrontations followed. Direct, emotional, unavoidable. Connie made it clear she wouldn't accept deception. She demanded the affair end. And more importantly, she started taking control of her own future. Divorce became a real possibility. Legal and financial consequences weren't abstract anymore. They were front and center. Custody, assets, long-term stability. For Richard, this meant more than emotional fallout. It meant exposure, losing control over the story he'd been managing at home and with Michelle. It meant the possibility of accountability, financial loss, and the collapse of the life he'd been trying to protect. And yet, the affair didn't stop. Phone records later showed that Richard kept communicating with Michelle even after Connie confronted him. Messages continued. Plans were made. Promises were exchanged. He was trying to live two lives at once, one where his marriage stayed intact and another where his relationship with Michelle continued without consequences. But the pressure was building. Connie wasn't backing down. She was asking questions. She was demanding transparency. She was moving closer to decisions that couldn't be undone. By December, the situation reached a breaking point. One path meant facing the consequences of his actions. The other meant doing whatever it took to make sure those consequences never arrived. And somewhere between those two paths, a choice was made. December 23, 2015, started like any other weekday in the Dabate household. On the surface, there was nothing to suggest it would end in violence. That morning, Connie Dabate followed her usual routine. She got her two sons ready for school, gathered their things, and drove them to their drop-offs. Surveillance footage later confirmed it. Ordinary, predictable, calm. After dropping the kids off, Connie returned home. She planned to go into work later that afternoon for her nursing shift. The house was quiet. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing to suggest anything was wrong. Phone records show that she made calls and sent messages that morning. Nothing hinted at fear or concern. From the outside, it was just a normal day. Routine, not alarming. Richard Dabate, meanwhile, was already at work. He left the house empty when Connie returned. That morning, his movements and later what he claimed happened would become a central focus of the investigation. Because what he said happened, and what the data would eventually show, didn't line up. Sometime in the early afternoon, Connie was still at home. She never left. At about 3 p.m., 911 received a call from Richard. He told dispatchers there had been a shooting. He said he had been shot inside his home, and his wife had been shot too. The call was frantic. Richard sounded hurt, shaken, and urgent. He kept insisting that a masked man had broken in and attacked them. Police and emergency responders arrived quickly. Inside the house, they found Connie Dabate in the basement. She had been shot once and was pronounced dead at the scene. Richard was alive but injured, with a gunshot wound to his leg and other injuries suggesting a struggle had taken place. At first glance, the scene seemed to match Richard's story. There was no immediate sign the crime was staged. The house wasn't ransacked, but that didn't rule out a home invasion. There was no suspect, and no weapon was immediately recovered. Richard was taken for medical treatment, and that's when investigators faced a familiar problem. One survivor, one story, and a crime scene that raised more questions than it answered. At the time, there was no reason to doubt him. But that would change. Once Richard was stabilized, he told investigators what he claimed had happened that afternoon. According to him, he got home earlier than usual and was confronted by a masked intruder, someone he didn't recognize. The man was armed. He ordered Richard to lie face down on the floor and at some point shot him in the leg. Despite the injury, Richard said he struggled with the attacker before the man moved further into the house. Richard said the intruder then went toward Connie. He claimed he heard a gunshot from another part of the house and believed that was when his wife was shot. After that, he said the intruder fled, leaving both of them behind. It was a terrifying story, one that, on the surface, fit a familiar pattern. A random act of violence, a family caught off guard, lives upended in an instant. And in those first moments, that's how the police treated it. Richard was treated as a victim. Officers documented his injuries, secured the scene, and began canvassing the neighborhood, looking for witnesses, suspicious vehicles, anything that might support the idea of an unknown suspect. But as detectives took a closer look at Richard's account, questions started to surface, not because of what he said, but because of what didn't quite add up. According to Richard, the intruder didn't take anything. No valuables were missing. Nothing appeared disturbed beyond the struggle itself. There were no signs of forced entry. And the timing, when Richard said he got home, when the confrontation happened, when Connie was shot, was unusually specific. Investigators began comparing his statements with physical evidence and digital records. That's when the first cracks appeared. Richard's timeline soon ran into data that couldn't be argued with. At first, the inconsistencies were small. Nothing that immediately blew apart his story, but enough to make detectives slow down. Richard had given a detailed account of his movements that afternoon. When he left work, when he arrived home, how long the encounter lasted. On paper, it sounded precise. But precision invites verification. Investigators pulled data from Richard's vehicle. It showed when the car was started, when it moved, and when it arrived at the house. Those timestamps didn't line up with what Richard had said. The difference wasn't huge, but it mattered. According to the data, Richard arrived home later than he claimed. That narrowed the window in which the alleged intruder could have entered the house, far more than Richard's story allowed. Then detectives looked at Richard's cell phone. Phone records showed activity during periods when Richard said he was already home or already injured. Calls and messages appeared at times that didn't match his version of events. Each issue, on its own, might have been explainable. Taken together, they started to form a pattern. The most unexpected piece of evidence came from something few people would expect to matter in a homicide investigation. Richard was wearing a Fitbit. The device tracked his movement throughout the day, steps taken, changes in activity, moments of motion and stillness. Investigators went through the data carefully. Richard said that after he was shot, he was largely unable to move. The Fitbit told a different story. It showed him walking through the house after the time he claimed the shooting happened, moving between areas, taking steps that suggested deliberate movement, not the actions of someone incapacitated by a gunshot wound. At that point, the timeline began to fall apart. If Richard was moving after the time he said he'd been shot, then either his memory was wrong or his story was. And the more investigators compared his statements to the data, the harder it became to make the two fit. This wasn't about a single mistake. It was about a version of events that no longer matched the facts. What had first looked like a tragic home invasion was now something else entirely. A story built on details that couldn't hold up under scrutiny. Slowly, the focus of the investigation began to shift, away from an unknown intruder and toward the man who survived. As detectives continued searching the house, they came across something unexpected. In the basement, where Connie Dabate had been found, they discovered an audio recording device. Its presence raised immediate questions. Why was it there? And what had it captured? When investigators asked Richard about it, he offered an explanation. He said he had placed the device in the basement to record conversations. He claimed he wanted documentation of discussions between himself and Connie related to divorce, custody, or finances. It was unusual, but not illegal. What mattered was the recording itself. When investigators reviewed the audio, they found a file from the day of the shooting. The recording wasn't clear from start to finish. Some parts were hard to understand. Others were incomplete, but certain things were unmistakable. They could hear voices, and one of them belonged to Connie. The recording captured a conversation between Connie and Richard, calm on the surface but tense underneath. The discussion seemed to revolve around their relationship and the ongoing conflict over Richard's affair. At no point in the audio was there any sign of an intruder. No unfamiliar voice, no sudden interruption, no struggle, at least not the way Richard had described it. What the recording did capture was a sequence of events that didn't match Richard's timeline. Prosecutors would later argue that the audio suggested Connie was shot during or immediately after this conversation, not during a random encounter with a stranger. The timing in the recording directly conflicted with Richard's version of the shooting, and that conflict couldn't be ignored. Audio doesn't forget. It doesn't reinterpret itself. It exists exactly as it was captured. For investigators, the basement recording wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was a turning point. The idea of a masked intruder started to collapse under the weight of something far more personal and far more damning. What had happened in that basement wasn't random. It was deliberate. Now investigators had a voice from the past, one that couldn't be coached, altered, or rewritten. As they analyzed the recording alongside the digital data, the case began to move in a new direction, toward motive, toward intent, and toward the person who had been controlling the story from the start. Attention soon turned to someone who had mostly been in the background until now, Michelle Troconis. She was Richard Dabate's co-worker and the woman he'd been involved with, someone whose name had appeared early in the investigation, but whose role wasn't fully understood. Detectives started by reviewing phone records. What they found raised immediate questions. In the months leading up to Connie's death, Richard and Michelle had been in constant contact. Calls, texts, messages, sometimes late at night, sometimes during work hours. More importantly, their communication didn't stop after the shooting. Records showed Richard reached out to Michelle shortly after Connie had been killed, before any details of the crime were publicly released. To investigators, that timing was significant. Michelle was questioned about her relationship with Richard and what she knew about December 23rd. She admitted to the affair and acknowledged it had been ongoing and serious. She described Richard as unhappy in his marriage and said he had talked about a future with her, but she denied any involvement in the crime itself. She said she believed Richard's story that a home invasion had occurred. Investigators were skeptical. They focused on inconsistencies in Michelle's statements, particularly about her communications with Richard in the hours and days around the shooting. What was discussed? What did she know? Had any information been shared before it was made public? Prosecutors would later argue that Michelle was more than a passive observer. They alleged she had helped Richard manage the immediate fallout, shaping narratives, concealing information, guiding what he said and when. Michelle denied those claims. But as evidence mounted, digital records, timelines, testimony, the investigation began to expand beyond a single suspect. What had started as a case built around one man's story had grown more complex. It involved networks of relationships, webs of loyalty and self-interest, and a growing belief that Connie Dabate's death was not an isolated act. It was the result of decisions made by more than one person. And as the case moved closer to trial, the focus sharpened. Because soon, these questions wouldn't be investigated behind closed doors. They would be argued publicly, carefully, under oath. By 2019, the case against Richard Dabate had made its way into the courtroom. Months of investigation, analysis, and digital reconstruction culminated in a legal battle that would determine his fate. Prosecutors laid out a story, built carefully on evidence, the Fitbit and digital timeline that contradicted Richard's account of events. Phone records showing ongoing communication with Michelle Troconis before and after Connie's death. The basement audio recording, capturing a tense conversation between Connie and Richard just moments before she was shot. Witness testimony about Richard's affair and the potential motives tied to financial and personal gain. They argued that Richard's story of a masked intruder was fabricated, a staged event meant to cover up his own actions. To the prosecution, this wasn't a sudden violent outburst. It was a calculated plan executed in a moment of desperation. The defense presented a different view. They suggested the evidence could be misread. The Fitbit data, they said, didn't prove intent. The phone records and messages were circumstantial. And while the audio recording was revealing, it couldn't definitively place Richard at fault beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom became a battle over timelines, data, and interpretation. Each side examined the details of the day, when Richard arrived home, when Connie was confronted, and what the recording truly showed. As the trial went on, though, the weight of the digital and physical evidence began to shift the story. Prosecutors pointed out inconsistencies in Richard's statements and demonstrated how technology didn't lie. Fitbit steps, phone timestamps, surveillance footage, patterns of movement and communication suggested planning, not chance. Michelle Troconis's role was also scrutinized, though separately. Prosecutors argued that while she wasn't charged with murder, she had knowledge of the affair and, by extension, of the circumstances surrounding Connie's death. They claimed she helped Richard manage the immediate fallout, shaping narratives and concealing information. Michelle denied these allegations. For Connie's family, the trial was painful. Every private detail was now public. Photos, timelines, recordings, they were all examined in court. Emotions ran high, but the jury's responsibility was to focus on evidence alone. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and expert analysis, the case rested. The question remained, had this been a tragic home invasion or a carefully orchestrated crime? Finally, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom was tense. Every seat was filled. Friends, family, legal teams, and the public waited, knowing life for those involved, especially Connie's family, would never be the same. The jury had reviewed the timelines, Fitbit data, phone records, text messages, and the basement audio. They had heard experts explain how the digital evidence contradicted Richard's story. They had considered the personal and financial motives tied to his affair. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear. Richard Dabate was guilty of murder. The decision confirmed the prosecution's argument from the start. Connie Dabate's death was not random. It had been carefully planned by the person who claimed to be her survivor. The judge sentenced Richard Dabate to 65 years in prison, a reflection of the premeditation and gravity of the crime. Michelle Troconis, while not charged with murder, later faced convictions for related crimes, including conspiracy and evidence tampering. Her sentencing acknowledged her role in the events surrounding Connie's death, even though she did not commit the murder herself. For Connie's family, the verdict brought some accountability. The person responsible would no longer be free to cause harm, but it could never bring back what they had lost. Her 2 young sons were left to grow up without their mother. Friends and family were left to grapple with the sudden, violent absence of someone who had been a constant presence in their lives. Even after the trial, the story felt unfinished. Questions lingered about the moments leading up to the shooting, the choices made that day, and the private struggles that had gone unseen until tragedy struck. Connie Dabate's life was cut short, but her story and the lessons it carries about trust, betrayal, and the consequences of hidden lives continues to resonate far beyond the walls of that quiet Connecticut home. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in real investigations, shocking cases, and justice served, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us as we explore more true crime stories.